but you always want to bevel the metal, leaving at least a small gap. 60-10 or 60-11 will provide good penetration, and for the first pass are a little easier to deal with in any of the weld positions. You can use a whip or step motion, gouging into the metal for penetration, then pushing the puddle in to fill. Watch both sides to avoid undercutting along the edges. For more weld buildup, try using a modified circular motion, always coming back to the leading edge of the puddle in the bottom of the joint. If you can handle the puddle, you can also use a filler rod. With 60-13 or 70-18, hold the rod fairly perpendicular. Use a slight side-to-side movement and avoid jamming the rod into the sides. Depending on the bevel and gap, you may need to follow the metal to maintain a uniform arc gap. The base metal is getting thicker as you come up the bevel, taking more heat. During the weld, you want to see the edges of the puddle flowing out and tying in on the sides of the bevel. After the first pass, chip the slag, clean it with a brush, and you're ready to fill and cap. If you can get to both sides of the metal, you can weld the backside for a stronger joint. Grind down to clean metal, keeping the depth and width uniform. With the rod angled a little more, slow the travel speed and build up welds slightly wider than the groove and above flush with the surface. Some welding situations require complete penetration for strength. If the pieces being joined do not fit up perfectly, or with some grades of hardened steel that tend to crack on the first pass, a backup bar is used. A V-bevel with a backup bar is also the procedure for structural welding tests. The goal is to melt and fuse the bottom edges of the pieces being joined to the backup bar. Prepare the bevels with slightly less of an angle and a feathered edge. Grind off the mill scale on the backup bar. Only a narrow strip is going to get tied in, and you don't want surface impurities taking the heat. Fit the backup bar tight with around 1/4 of an inch gap. This type of joint is generally welded all the way with at least a 1/8 70-18, and you have to be able to get the rod all the way to the bottom. Either tack up on the backside, staggering the tacks, or in the bevel. When you tack in the bevel, grind the starts and stops thin. Always keep in mind, along with fusing the pieces at the bottom, you also want the top of the weld relatively flat to avoid trapping slag. In the flat position, hold the rod nearly straight up and down, angled slightly back towards the weld. Keep the arc on the leading edge of the puddle. With a slight side-to-side movement, pay attention to the arc gap. You want to see the edges of the molten pool tying into the sides of the bevel to avoid crowning the bead. When you're using 70-18 in a bevel, stay ahead of the weld buildup and slag. If molten slag is pushed in front of the rod, it can interfere with the arc or limit filler metal fusion along the sides. On vertical up welds, you won't have any problems fusing the base metal to the backup bar. You do want to keep the weld bead flat without undercutting along the edges. Keep the rod fairly perpendicular to the metal, angled up slightly. The puddle needs to flow out on the sides for a flat weld bead and to avoid undercutting. Travel up fast enough to keep the metal from overheating, which causes the molten puddle to spill down. You may need to lower the amperage a little, maybe 5 amps or so, but don't lower it too much, as many problems are caused by running too cold on verticals as by running too hot. Remember, the amperage only provides the heat. It's the travel speed, rod angle, and arc gap that determine just how hot the metal is going to get. On overhead butt joints with a backup bar, you don't get to build up quite as much weld bead. With the rod nearly straight up and down, adjust the travel speed to let the puddle spread out without overheating the metal. Most of the problems with overhead come from not controlling the rod. When the tip dances around, varying the arc gap, the amount of heat at the weld is not uniform and focused. Arc gap, the amount of heat at the weld is not uniform and focused. Find some way to steady yourself so you can control that rod. Also, if the rod is angled too far back towards the weld, the molten filler metal takes the heat instead of the metal, causing the puddle to drip. Horizontal is generally not used for welding tests, but you often get them in practical situations. Angle the rod up and slightly into the weld. The bottom bevel acts as kind of a landing, helping to hold the weld, so you may be able to use a slight rod movement. Watch the top side and push the puddle up. Set the amperage to allow a fast enough travel speed so the base metals don't overheat, which causes the puddle to become too fluid. Don't try to carry a lot of metal on a horizontal. Just get all the pieces tied together and keep the filler metal from sagging. The last type of root is in a V-beveled open butt joint. We're going to shove a 60-10 rod deep into the gap and run a weld bead on the back side of the metal. Preparation and fit up are more critical, so take your time getting the metal ready. The edge of the bevel needs to be straight and square. Grind off all the mill scale on the bottom side. A half-round file works good to clean up the inside of square tubing or pipe. The landing should be uniform. Use a file to knock down any high spots. With a 1/8 60-10, I use a 1/16 oxyacetylene welding rod as a spacer with around a 1/16 landing. The size of the gap and landing can vary a little, but when you figure out what you like, try to keep it consistent for every weld you make. Line up the bottom edges of the metal. With a spacer to adjust the gap, run one tack, pushing the rod right down into the gap. Before you finish tacking up, remove the spacer. As tacks cool, they contract and the spacer gets jammed up. So pull the spacer, make sure the gap is uniform, and finish tacking the joint. On heavier pieces, after the first tack, use a small wedge or a screwdriver to keep the gap uniform. Because of the taper, you can remove these after the joint is completely tacked. On square tubing, tack opposite corners. For pipe, opposite sides. Make sure the gap is uniform, straightening when necessary, then put in 2 more tacks. Flat, horizontal, overhead, and vertical down root passes are all done the same way. Grind the edges of the starts and stops thin. Hold the rod perpendicular to the metal. Scratch start right on the tack. Push the rod down into the puddle and start moving. The filler metal will squirt out the back until you hit the thinned out edge of the tack, and it can poke through. Then move as fast as you can keep the gap filling in. If you're not getting all the way through, you will see filler metal squirting out behind the rod, back up in the bevel. Most of the light and sparks will be on the back side, and you're building weld on the back of the metal. You want the amperage relatively high, so try starting about the same place as you'd run flat. If you do open a hole, stop right away, pulling the rod back over the bead. Restart right at the edge and keep going. When you finish the weld, grind the edges thin on both sides of the hole and fill it in. Some welding procedures require a vertical uproot pass, and generally, you'll need to run about 5 amps lower for uphill. The easiest way is to prepare the metal exactly the same, with a uniform narrow gap, shoving the rod in perpendicular and moving up as fast as the gap fills in. Some welders like to thin out the landing a little more, and with a step motion, rip a small keyhole, then fill it in, rip a hole, and fill it in, always keeping the rod deep in the gap. Other welders like to leave a little thicker landing and wider gap, here again using a step motion, laying metal in and making sure it's fusing on the bottom corners. The disadvantage to stepping the root is the possibility of undercutting along the edges on the back side. The advantage is that you actually see the root going in for 100% penetration. Stepping the root uphill also works well when the gap is uneven with wide or narrow spots. The backside bead should be above flush,